Good evening, my dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel.
On a bitter winter morning in Cedar Hollow, retired Navy SEAL Daniel Brooks crossed the old mill bridge, expecting only wind and snow. But beneath the frozen riverbank, a German shepherd lay trembling beside the poisoned Elk River, barely alive. Daniel had spent years burying every memory that still hurt, yet one weak paw reached toward him, like fate refusing to let him walk away. A pale winter morning settled over Cedar Hollow, Colorado, soft as wool and cold enough to make every breath look like a secret leaving the body. Snow rested on the roofs of the small mountain town, on the pine branches, on the old wooden signs outside shuttered stores, and on the narrow road that curved toward Elk River. Daniel Brooks ran alone along that road, as he did most mornings, not because he loved running anymore, but because movement kept the old memories from catching him by the throat. He was 54, a retired Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, a lean frame, and a weathered face cut by years of sun, salt, snow, and silence. His gray-blue eyes had the calm of a man who noticed exits before greetings, danger before beauty. Years earlier, during deployments overseas, Daniel had worked beside military dogs in places where explosions came faster than prayers. One of those dogs had died saving his unit, and something inside Daniel had quietly shut down afterward. Since retiring, he had built himself a small life near the lake outside Cedar Hollow. A wooden cabin, an old pickup truck, stacks of firewood, and routines simple enough not to hurt him. The town itself had once depended on mining, but after the old Blackstone Ridge mine closed, Cedar Hollow slowly began fading like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. Stores closed earlier now. Young people moved away. The church parking lot stayed fuller than the school lot most winters. Lately, however, hope had returned, in cautious little sparks, because Blackstone Energy promised to reopen the mine and bring jobs back. Some people spoke about the company as if it were salvation itself. Others kept quieter. Daniel crossed Old Mill Bridge just as weak sunlight began spreading across the frozen river below. The bridge creaked softly beneath his boots. He slowed, resting one gloved hand against the frost-covered railing while looking down toward Elk River. The water moved dark and slow beneath sheets of cracked ice. It should have looked peaceful. Instead, something about the river always unsettled him lately. Too quiet, too empty. Last spring he used to see ducks gathering near the reeds and trout flashing beneath the current. Now there were mornings when the river looked abandoned by life itself. A scraping sound drifted upward through the cold air. Daniel frowned immediately. Not wind, not ice. Something alive. He leaned farther over the railing and saw a dark shape half buried beneath snow near the eastern bank. Instinct moved faster than thought. He climbed down the slope carefully, boots sliding against frozen mud while snow crumbled beneath him. The smell reached him before the animal did. Bitter. Chemical. Wrong. Daniel stopped for half a second. Beneath the clean scent of pine and ice lingered something sharp that reminded him of machine fluid and burned metal. Then he saw the dog. A German shepherd lay collapsed beside the river, large but terribly thin beneath soaked fur matted with icy mud. The dog looked around 4 or 5 years old, black and tan coat, scar along the left ear. One paw stretched weakly toward the snow, as if it had tried crawling away from the water before collapsing. Frost clung to its muzzle. Daniel dropped to one knee. "Easy," he murmured automatically, though the dog barely moved. He removed one glove and pressed 2 fingers carefully beneath the animal's jawline, until he found the pulse. Weak, fast, still alive. Relief hit him harder than expected. The shepherd trembled violently once, foam gathering near its mouth. Poison, Daniel thought immediately, or something close enough. The dog's eyelids fluttered open for barely a second. Dark amber eyes met Daniel's face. There was no growl, no fear, only exhaustion so deep it looked ancient. Daniel felt something old and painful shift inside his chest. Terrible place to take a nap, he muttered quietly. Humor had always been his way of standing near grief without letting it swallow him whole. He unzipped his running jacket and wrapped it around the dog's body. The shepherd was lighter than it should have been, all ribs and stubbornness beneath the wet fur. Daniel glanced toward the bridge above him, calculating distances automatically. His truck sat half a mile away near the trail entrance. The logical part of him suggested calling for help first. The older soldier inside him knew the dog might not survive the weight. He slid one arm beneath the shepherd's chest and another under its hind legs. "Stay with me," he said softly before he could stop himself. The words carried ghosts with them. Old battlefields, old blood, old promises he had failed to keep. The climb back up the slope burned through his legs and lungs. Snow slipped beneath his boots twice, nearly sending both of them backward. By the time he reached the bridge again, cold sweat clung beneath his thermal shirt despite the freezing air. Cedar Hollow looked peaceful in the distance, smoke curling from chimneys while morning lights glowed warmly through frosted windows. The town had no idea something terrible was already moving beneath its river. Daniel laid the shepherd carefully across the back seat of his truck and turned the heater to maximum. The dog shivered once beneath the blanket Daniel threw over him. Then came another weak sound from the animal's throat, almost too faint to hear. Daniel grabbed his phone and called the only veterinarian in town. Emily Carter answered after 3 rings. "Please tell me this isn't another raccoon emergency," she said sleepily. Daniel almost smiled despite himself. Emily was 38, tall and slender with auburn hair usually tied into a loose knot that never survived an entire workday. Her green eyes carried constant exhaustion, but also a warmth that made nervous animals trust her quickly. She had returned to Cedar Hollow years earlier to care for her aging father after her mother died, sacrificing a successful veterinary career in Denver without ever complaining about it aloud. "Dog," Daniel said. "German shepherd. Hypothermia. Possible poisoning." Silence instantly sharpened on the other end. "How long?" 10 minutes. "Make it 7. The line disconnected. Daniel looked back again at the shepherd lying across the seat. The dog's breathing came shallow and uneven, fogging the cold window beside him. Snow began falling harder now, soft flakes drifting down like ashes from a silent fire. Daniel drove through Cedar Hollow while the town slowly woke around him. Outside Martha Greene's bakery, an elderly woman in a thick red scarf shoveled snow angrily enough to suggest she considered winter a personal enemy. Martha was 68, short and round-faced, with silver curls escaping beneath her knit cap. Widowed for over a decade, she possessed the rare ability to insult people affectionately while feeding them homemade pie. She noticed Daniel's truck speeding past and frowned toward the covered shape in the back seat. People in Cedar Hollow noticed everything, eventually. By the time Daniel reached Cedar Hollow Veterinary Care, Emily already stood waiting beneath the porch light, wearing blue scrubs beneath a heavy brown coat. The clinic smelled of antiseptic, coffee, cedarwood, and wet fur. Daniel carried the shepherd inside while Emily prepared the treatment table with calm efficiency. Her hands moved quickly but gently over the dog's body. "God," she whispered softly after checking the gums and heartbeat. "He's freezing." "Found him near the river." Emily glanced up sharply. Elk River? Daniel nodded once. Something unreadable crossed her face before she inserted an IV needle carefully into the dog's leg. "This makes the third animal this month," she said quietly. Daniel stared at her. "Third? A fox, 2 dead geese, similar symptoms." Emily adjusted the warming blanket around the shepherd while snow tapped softly against the clinic windows. "I hoped it was coincidence." The shepherd suddenly trembled hard enough to shake the metal table. Daniel instinctively stepped closer. Emily checked the monitor, her jaw tightening. "Come on," she murmured to the dog. "Not today." For several long seconds, only the sound of the heater filled the room. Then slowly, painfully, the shepherd opened its eyes again. This time the gaze held steady on Daniel. The dog's paw shifted weakly across the blanket until trembling claws brushed against Daniel's wrist. Daniel froze completely. The contact lasted only a second, barely more than a whisper of wait, but it felt strangely familiar, like an old promise returning after years of silence. Emily saw it too, but said nothing. Outside, snow continued falling across Cedar Hollow, while beneath the frozen river, something poisonous moved quietly through the dark water, unseen by most of the town. But inside the warm clinic, beside the frightened heartbeat of a dying dog, Daniel Brooks felt the first crack appear in the lonely life he had spent years building around himself. Snow continued falling over Cedar Hollow through most of the following day, softening the roofs, burying tire tracks, and wrapping the mountain town in a silence that felt almost holy. The storm clouds sat low above the pine ridges surrounding Elk River, turning the world pale gray and dim even after morning arrived. Inside Cedar Hollow Veterinary Care, warmth hummed softly through old heaters, while the smell of cedar shavings, coffee, antiseptic, and wet fur settled into every corner of the clinic. Daniel Brooks stood beside the treatment room window, holding a paper cup of burnt coffee he had forgotten to drink nearly 20 minutes earlier. He had slept less than 2 hours, not because anyone asked him to stay, but because leaving had somehow begun to feel impossible. The German shepherd remained alive, though barely. The dog lay beneath a heated blanket, while clear fluids moved slowly through the IV line attached to one front leg. Its breathing no longer rattled as violently as the night before, but exhaustion still hung over the animal like a shadow too heavy to shake loose. Emily Carter adjusted the monitor beside the table with practiced movements. Her auburn hair had escaped its loose knot again, falling around a face made paler by fatigue. She looked like the kind of woman who carried too much responsibility without ever asking anyone to notice. There were faint circles beneath her green eyes this morning, but her hands remained calm and steady while checking the dog's pulse. "He made it through the night," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "You sound surprised." "I am." Emily pulled the blanket higher around the shepherd's shoulders. "Most animals that cold and poisoned don't fight this hard." The dog stirred weakly at the sound of her voice. One scarred ear twitched. Daniel watched the movement more carefully than he intended. Emily noticed, because Emily noticed nearly everything. "You can sit down, you know," she said. "Standing there glaring at him won't speed recovery." Daniel looked toward the window instead of answering. Outside, snow drifted across the parking lot while a battered delivery truck crawled slowly past the clinic. Cedar Hollow looked smaller during storms, as if winter squeezed the entire town closer together. Emily studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You've been here almost 12 hours. "I've had longer nights." The answer came too quickly. Afghanistan flashed briefly through his mind before he forced it away. Dust storms, radio static, a military working dog named Ranger barking once, before an explosion swallowed half the hillside. Daniel swallowed hard and focused back on the present. Emily's voice softened. Still doesn't mean you're made of stone. Before Daniel could answer, the clinic bell rang loudly in the front lobby. A burst of cold air swept through the hallway along with the smell of cinnamon bread and snow. Martha Greene entered, carrying a large paper bag against her chest like sacred cargo. She wore a thick red wool coat stretched tightly around her small, round frame, and snowflakes clung stubbornly to the silver curls escaping beneath her knitted cap. At 68, Martha moved with the determined energy of a woman too busy to grow old properly. Widowhood had sharpened her tongue, but softened her heart. "I brought breakfast," she announced without greeting anyone first. "And before either of you objects, I already decided you're eating it." Emily smiled tiredly. "You're becoming terrifying." "I became terrifying in 1987. Martha placed the bag on the counter and immediately spotted the dog. Her expression changed at once. The sharp humor faded from her pale blue eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered softly. She stepped closer to the table. The shepherd opened his eyes halfway, dark amber beneath heavy lids. Martha crouched carefully despite her aching knees. "Poor thing." Daniel noticed something strange then. The dog did not flinch away from her voice. Instead, his breathing slowed slightly. Martha reached toward the scarred ear but stopped before touching him. "Someone loved this dog once," she said quietly. "You can always tell." Emily handed Martha a cup of coffee. "No collar, no chip. Nobody's called asking about him." Martha frowned. "That's odd around here. Folks in Cedar Hollow lose casseroles slower than they lose dogs." Daniel finally spoke. "Maybe he wandered from another town." Martha shook her head immediately. "No." She pointed toward the shepherd's paws. "See that?" Daniel looked closer. The pads were rough, cracked by mountain terrain rather than pavement. "Working dog," Martha continued, "or hunting dog. Not some house pet that escaped a backyard." The shepherd shifted weakly under the blanket again. Emily checked the IV line while Martha lowered her voice. "You know what else is strange?" Daniel glanced toward her. Martha leaned closer, as though the clinic walls might be listening. 3 nights this week I saw trucks heading toward Blackstone Ridge after midnight." Emily's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Supply trucks?" "No company logos, black paint, covered trailers." Martha narrowed her eyes. "And nobody runs mining equipment that late during snowstorms unless they're hiding something." Daniel felt that old military instinct stir quietly in his chest. Observation, pattern recognition. The small internal alarm that years of war had burned permanently into his nerves. "You tell the sheriff?" Martha snorted. "Sheriff Collins is too busy smiling at Blackstone executives every Sunday after church." Emily sighed softly. "Martha." "What?" Martha folded her arms. "I'm old, not blind." Silence settled briefly across the treatment room. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the windows. Daniel looked again at the shepherd lying beneath the heated blanket. Foam no longer clung to the dog's mouth, but the animal still looked terribly worn down, like something had been slowly draining the life out of him for weeks. "This wasn't one bad drink," Daniel murmured. Emily looked up immediately. "What?" Daniel stepped closer to the table. "The river poisoning, whatever this is." He pointed carefully toward the dog's thinning ribs and damaged paw pads. "He's been exposed for a while." Emily studied the shepherd thoughtfully. "Repeated contamination," she admitted quietly. Maybe. Daniel's jaw tightened. I found a chemical film beneath the ice yesterday. Martha's face darkened. I knew that river smelled wrong lately. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The storm outside deepened, snow swirling harder through the parking lot. Then suddenly the shepherd lifted his head weakly for the first time. The effort clearly hurt him. His amber eyes locked directly onto Daniel. Emily blinked in surprise. Well, she whispered. That's new. The dog stared at Daniel another second before lowering his head again, exhausted by even that small movement. Something painful twisted quietly inside Daniel's chest. He hated how familiar this felt. Years ago, Ranger used to watch him the exact same way before missions. Total trust, total dependence. The kind that terrified him now. Emily broke the silence gently. He needs a name. Daniel immediately looked away. He needs medication. He can have both, Martha smirked into her coffee cup. Emily glanced back toward the dog. Shadow, she said softly after a moment. Daniel frowned slightly. Why Shadow? Emily smiled faintly. Because he looks like one. The shepherd's scarred ear twitched once at the sound. Martha pointed triumphantly. See? He approves. Daniel muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like surrender. By late afternoon, Emily finally forced Daniel to leave the clinic for several hours while she monitored Shadow's condition. Snow had stopped by then, leaving Cedar Hollow buried beneath a cold, silver stillness. Daniel drove slowly back toward his cabin near Pine Lake. The road curved beside Elk River, and for the first time he pulled the truck onto the snowy shoulder near Old Mill Bridge. The river moved darkly beneath broken ice sheets. Daniel stepped out carrying several empty glass jars, rubber gloves, and an old military flashlight from the truck bed. Cold wind immediately bit through his jacket. He crouched beside the riverbank where he had found Shadow. The faint chemical smell still lingered beneath the scent of pine and snow. Daniel filled one jar carefully with river water, then another with slushy ice gathered near the muddy bank. He noticed strange discoloration trapped beneath part of the frozen surface, dull gray streaks drifting like smoke underwater. His stomach tightened. A memory hit him suddenly. Afghanistan. Burn pits outside the base perimeter. Dogs refusing to drink from contaminated runoff. Ranger growling low beside blackened water under moonlight. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not again, he whispered to himself. Darkness had nearly fallen by the time he returned home with the samples. His cabin stood alone among tall pines near the frozen edge of Pine Lake, warm yellow light spilling softly through the windows. Daniel placed the water jars carefully on the kitchen counter before building fresh logs into the fireplace. The quiet inside the cabin usually comforted him. Tonight, it only felt empty. Around 9 o'clock, Emily called. He's stable enough to leave tomorrow if he keeps improving. Daniel stared at the fire. You trust me with him? No, Emily replied dryly, but he clearly does. Daniel almost smiled. After hanging up, he prepared an old wool blanket and thick padded bed near the fireplace. He told himself it was temporary, strictly practical. The kind of lie lonely people become very skilled at telling themselves. The next afternoon, Shadow finally arrived at the cabin, wrapped carefully beneath blankets in the back seat of Daniel's truck. The dog walked slowly inside on trembling legs, while snow drifted gently outside the windows. Daniel pointed toward the padded bed beside the fire. There, he said quietly. Best spot in the house. Shadow sniffed the bed once. Then, ignoring it completely. The German shepherd walked stiffly across the room toward the narrow hallway near the front door. With visible effort, he lowered himself directly between the entrance and the rest of the cabin floor. Guard position. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. Seriously? Shadow closed his eyes but did not move. Even exhausted, poisoned, and barely recovered, the dog had chosen to guard the door. Daniel stood silently beside the fire while snow whispered softly against the cabin windows.
For years he had lived alone, because distance felt safer than loss. But now, in the quiet mountain cabin, a wounded German shepherd had placed himself between Daniel Brooks and the outside world, as if the decision required no thought at all. Morning arrived slowly over Cedar Hollow, as though winter itself felt too tired to climb fully into the sky. A dull silver light spread across the mountains, while Elk River moved silently beneath sheets of cracked ice, carrying something unseen through the sleeping valley. Smoke rose from chimneys in crooked gray ribbons, and the town looked peaceful enough to fool strangers. But Daniel Brooks had lived long enough to distrust beautiful silence. Sometimes, silence only meant danger had learned patience. Inside his cabin, the fire crackled softly, while shadow remained stretched across the narrow hallway near the front door, exactly where Daniel had found him hours earlier. The German shepherd had not moved much during the night, except to occasionally lift his scarred ear whenever wind brushed against the cabin walls. Even asleep, the dog behaved like something trained by hardship rather than comfort. Daniel stood near the kitchen counter, staring at the jars of river water he collected the evening before. In daylight, the contamination looked worse. Thin gray streaks floated beneath the surface like smoke trapped under water. One jar carried a faint metallic sheen that caught the morning light wrong. Daniel unscrewed the lid carefully and immediately smelled that same bitter chemical scent rising from inside. His jaw tightened. Shadow opened his eyes at once, watching him silently from the hallway. "Yeah," Daniel murmured. "I know." The dog's amber gaze followed him while Daniel packed the jars into an insulated case alongside his flashlight, notebook, and camera. Outside, snow crunched beneath his boots as he loaded the truck. Cedar Hollow remained half buried in winter stillness, though signs of life slowly appeared along Main Street. Martha Greene's bakery already glowed warmly behind frosted windows, while several old men in heavy coats gathered outside trading weather complaints like a sacred ritual. Martha herself stood near the entrance, carrying a tray of cinnamon rolls, barking orders at two teenage boys attempting to shovel her walkway incorrectly. "If you move snow that slowly," she snapped, "spring will arrive before you finish." Daniel almost smiled. Martha noticed him immediately. "Morning, mountain man," she called. "That dog still alive?" Stubbornly. "Good," Martha replied. "The town could use another stubborn creature." Daniel drove across town toward the small house where Emily Carter lived beside the clinic with her father. The home sat beneath tall pines near the edge of Cedar Hollow, modest and weathered by years of mountain winters. Emily opened the front door before he knocked. She wore a thick, cream-colored sweater over faded jeans, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders for once instead of tied back at the clinic. Without exhaustion pulling at her features, Daniel noticed she looked younger this morning, though sadness still lingered quietly around her eyes like something permanent. "You actually slept?" she asked suspiciously. "For a while." "Liar." Daniel handed her one of the sample jars. Emily frowned immediately after opening it. "God." "Thought you should see it." Before Emily could answer, a weak voice drifted from deeper inside the house. "Lucy?" Daniel glanced toward the hallway as an elderly man slowly emerged into view. Robert Carter moved carefully, with one hand resting against the wall for balance.
He looked somewhere near 75, though illness made age difficult to measure properly. Thin shoulders, faded blue robe, white hair combed neatly despite trembling hands.
His face carried the gentle confusion of a man whose memories had begun slipping away, one by one. Alzheimer's disease had stolen pieces of him gradually over the last 5 years. Some mornings he remembered Emily perfectly. Other days he confused her with her late mother. Yet strangely, he always remembered dogs. Robert smiled softly upon seeing Daniel. "Morning," he murmured politely. Then his eyes shifted toward the doorway behind Daniel. "Where's Duke?" Emily's expression changed instantly, softer now, touched with old heartbreak. "Dad," she said gently, "Duke's been gone a long time." Robert frowned slightly as if reality itself sounded incorrect. "No," he whispered. "He waits by the porch." Daniel remained silent. Emily once told him Duke had been a golden retriever her father adored before the illness worsened. The dog died nearly 8 years ago, but Robert still asked about him almost daily. Somehow the memory survived while birthdays, addresses, and entire decades faded away. Robert looked toward Daniel again. "Dogs remember people better than people remember themselves," he said quietly. Then he wandered slowly back toward the kitchen, humming something under his breath. Emily watched him disappear down the hallway. "Some days he forgets my name," she admitted softly. "But he still remembers Duke stealing pancakes off the counter in 2009. Daniel glanced toward the truck outside where Shadow waited inside beneath blankets. Maybe dogs leave deeper marks. Emily looked at him carefully. "That why you keep staring at Shadow like he's a ghost?" Daniel did not answer quickly enough. Emily noticed. Again. Before the silence could grow heavier, another truck pulled into the driveway. An older man climbed out carrying a leather satchel against his chest. Walter Hayes moved with the distracted energy of someone whose brain traveled faster than his body could follow. He was 71, tall but slightly bent at the shoulders, with sharp cheekbones, silver hair sticking wildly beneath a wool cap, and a long grey beard that looked trimmed only by accident. Thick glasses rested crookedly on his nose, while several pens poked from the front pocket of his weathered coat. Walter had once taught hydrology at the University of Colorado, before retiring to Cedar Hollow after his wife died from cancer nearly 15 years earlier. Since then, he spent most days studying rivers, snowfall, and old environmental records, because grief had left him needing systems and measurements to survive. "Emily!" he called while climbing the porch steps. "You said contaminated water, not coffee emergency." He noticed Daniel standing beside her. "Ah, the soldier." Daniel frowned slightly. "You know me?" Walter shrugged. "Small town. Everybody knows everybody. Also, you glare at people like you're evaluating sniper positions." Emily sighed. "Walter." "What?" "It's observational science." 20 minutes later, the three of them stood inside Walter's cluttered workshop behind his small house near the old rail tracks. Shelves overflowed with maps, sample containers, books, weather journals, and enough loose papers to suggest organized chaos had declared permanent residency there. A black and white border collie named Maggie slept beside the heater, lifting one tired eye occasionally before deciding nobody looked interesting enough to justify movement. Walter carefully poured some river water beneath a portable testing light. The chemical sheen became instantly visible. His expression darkened. "Well," he muttered, "that's deeply unpleasant." Emily crossed her arms tightly. "What is it?" Walter adjusted his glasses and reached for several test strips. "Could be industrial runoff, heavy metals maybe, solvents."
He dipped one strip into the sample. Seconds later, the color changed sharply. Walter stared at it without speaking.
Daniel noticed his hands stop moving entirely.
"Walter?" The old professor exhaled slowly through his beard.
"Lead traces. Possibly mercury."
Emily's face paled. "From the mine?" Walter looked toward the window where snow drifted lazily beyond the glass.
"Maybe."
Daniel's voice hardened. "You don't sound convinced." Walter rubbed one hand over his mouth thoughtfully. "Because Blackstone Ridge officially closed years ago." "Officially?" Daniel repeated. Walter nodded once. "Closed mines still leak sometimes. Old waste systems collapse. Drainage pipes crack." He hesitated. "But not usually like this." Silence settled heavily across the workshop. Maggie lifted her head now, sensing tension in the room. Daniel stared down at the contaminated water again. "Martha said trucks have been driving toward the mine at night." Walter's eyes narrowed immediately. "Recently?" "3 times this week." Walter slowly walked toward a large cabinet against the far wall.
"Then maybe," he murmured quietly, "we have a different problem." He unlocked the bottom drawer and removed several rolled maps bound with faded string. Dust rose into the warm workshop air. Walter spread one map carefully across the table beneath the lamp. It showed the original Blackstone Ridge mining layout from decades earlier, marked with drainage tunnels, runoff channels, and underground pipe systems. Emily leaned closer. "That's old." "Very." Walter traced one finger slowly across the paper. But old systems don't disappear simply because companies change names. Daniel studied the maze of lines carefully. Military instincts again. Patterns, weak points, hidden access routes. Walter suddenly stopped moving. His thick eyebrows lowered beneath the lamplight. "Well now," he whispered. Emily looked up sharply. "What?" Walter pointed toward a faded line barely visible near the lower edge of the map. "That shouldn't be there." Daniel stepped closer. A narrow drainage route extended from the old mine directly toward Elk River. Unlike the other markings, this one looked almost erased, hidden intentionally. Walter's face had gone pale beneath his beard. "Secret overflow pipe," he said quietly. "Used decades ago for emergency runoff during flooding." Emily frowned. "Why hide it?" Walter looked at both of them grimly. "Because legally it was supposed to be sealed before the mine closed." The room fell silent except for the ticking heater beside Maggie's bed. Outside, snow continued drifting softly across Cedar Hollow, while beneath the frozen ground, old pipes carried dark things toward the river, unseen by most of the town. Daniel stared at the faded line on the map and felt the same cold certainty he once felt before dangerous missions overseas. Something poisonous had been hidden beneath Cedar Hollow for a very long time. And now it was beginning to surface. Winter tightened its grip around Cedar Hollow by the end of the week. Snow fell harder now, no longer soft and gentle like drifting feathers, but sharp and relentless, driven sideways by mountain winds that screamed through the pine valleys after dark. Elk River disappeared beneath thicker ice, while the old roads leading toward Blackstone Ridge became narrow tunnels carved between walls of snow. Yet despite the worsening weather, life inside the small mountain town carried on in stubborn little ways. Martha Greene still opened her bakery before sunrise every morning. Sheriff Collins still drank burnt coffee at the diner every afternoon, while pretending not to notice how worried people had become. And Daniel Brooks still woke each dawn to find shadow lying across the front doorway of the cabin,
like a silent guardian posted there by fate itself. The German shepherd had recovered faster than Emily expected. The poison still lingered in his body, but strength had begun returning in visible pieces. His black and tan coat regained some shine beneath the winter light, though his ribs remained too sharp beneath the fur. The scar along his left ear stood out clearly now, pale against dark hair like an old wound carved by survival itself. Shadow rarely barked. Instead, he watched everything with intense amber eyes that seemed to weigh the world carefully before deciding whether to trust it. Daniel understood that look better than most people would. Some damage changed creatures permanently. That Saturday morning, Shadow followed Daniel through Cedar Hollow for the first time. Snow crunched beneath their boots and paws as they crossed Main Street together. Several townspeople stopped what they were doing to stare openly. Small towns loved mysteries almost as much as gossip. Martha leaned halfway out her bakery doorway carrying a tray of fresh bread.
"Look at him,"
she announced, loudly enough for half the street to hear.
"Like a furry sheriff with emotional problems."
Daniel shook his head slightly. "Morning to you too." Shadow ignored Martha completely, but remained close beside Daniel's leg while they walked. A few children playing near the church steps pointed excitedly toward the dock. One little girl cautiously waved. Shadow watched her silently for several seconds before giving one slow wag of his tail. The girl gasped like she had just received permission from royalty itself. Daniel noticed something then. Shadow moved differently whenever they neared the road leading toward Blackstone Ridge. His posture stiffened, ears lifted higher. The dog's nose tested the air repeatedly as though searching for something hidden beneath the scent of snow and pine. Daniel crouched beside him near the hardware store. "You smell it too, huh?" Shadow's gaze remained fixed northward toward the distant mountains. Inside the diner, later that afternoon, Martha Greene gathered several elderly women around the largest table near the windows, while pretending the meeting looked accidental. It did not. Martha sat at the center, wearing her thick red cardigan like battle armor. Beside her sat Evelyn Pike, a thin, retired schoolteacher with sharp cheekbones, steel-gray hair, and eyes so observant they made lying feel physically dangerous. Widowed twice and impressed by neither experience, Evelyn carried herself with the calm authority of someone who once controlled classrooms full of screaming children without raising her voice above polite disappointment. Across from her sat Dolores Bennett, 72 years old and built like a cheerful bulldozer. Dolores had broad shoulders, deeply tanned skin from decades working cattle ranches beside her late husband, and a booming laugh that could overpower thunderstorms when properly motivated. "This is ridiculous," Evelyn murmured while stirring tea carefully.
"Which part?"
Martha asked. "The possible environmental crime or the fact you called this meeting using coupon flyers?" Martha leaned back proudly. "Nobody suspects old women holding coupons." Dolores grinned. "Speak for yourself. I'm terrifying." Martha lowered her voice. "Listen carefully. I want truck license numbers, dates, times, anybody driving toward Blackstone Ridge after dark." Evelyn blinked slowly. "Martha." "Don't Martha me." Martha pointed a butter knife dramatically toward the group. "Something poisoned that river." Dolores crossed her arms. "And Sheriff Collins keeps acting blind." Martha nodded firmly. "Exactly. So congratulations, ladies." She smiled with alarming satisfaction. "We're now a surveillance operation." Evelyn sighed deeply into her tea. "This is how old people get murdered in documentaries." "Good," Martha replied. "Means we're interesting." Meanwhile, across town, Daniel spent most of the afternoon beside Walter Hayes, inside the cluttered workshop studying old maps. Snow tapped steadily against the windows while Maggie, the aging border collie, snored beside the heater. Walter traced drainage routes carefully across yellowed papers spread beneath several lamps. "If the overflow pipe still exists," he muttered, "then somebody may still be using it." Daniel leaned against the table, studying the map. "Can we prove it?" Walter adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "Eventually, maybe. But companies like Blackstone don't survive lawsuits by being careless." He glanced toward Daniel. "You planning something reckless?" "No." Walter narrowed his eyes. "You answered too fast." Daniel ignored that. Before either man could continue, Shadow suddenly lifted his head sharply near the workshop door. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body tightened at once. Daniel noticed immediately.
What is it?
Shadow gave a low growl so deep it barely sounded canine anymore. Then, without warning, he moved toward the door. Walter frowned. That dog hears things before weather changes. The storm arrived fully just after nightfall. Wind hammered Cedar Hollow hard enough to shake porch lights and bury roads beneath fresh drifts within hours. Visibility vanished beyond a few yards. Daniel had just finished stacking extra firewood beside the cabin when Shadow suddenly sprang upright near the doorway. The dog barked once, loud, urgent. Daniel froze immediately because Shadow almost never barked. "Easy!" But Shadow was already moving. The German shepherd paced toward the truck outside, whining low in his throat while snow blasted against the windows. Daniel grabbed his coat automatically. "What did you hear?" Shadow lunged toward the door again. Something about the dog's behavior felt wrong enough to set every old instinct alive inside Daniel's chest. He opened the door, and freezing wind instantly slammed into him. Shadow bolted forward through swirling snow. "Shadow!" Daniel followed immediately, boots sinking deep into fresh drifts, while the dog disappeared ahead between trees near the mountain road. Wind roared so loudly it swallowed everything else. Then faintly, somewhere beyond the storm, Daniel heard it. A horn. Weak. Repeating. Shadow stopped near a steep curve overlooking a narrow ravine. Snow had nearly buried part of the road entirely. Daniel's flashlight beam cut through the blizzard and finally found the shape below. A pickup truck rested half-tilted off the roadside embankment. One tire hung dangerously above the drop. Daniel slid down carefully toward the vehicle, while Shadow barked sharply beside him. Inside the truck sat a boy no older than 12, pale, frightened, crying silently beneath a heavy winter coat. "Hey!" Daniel shouted over the wind. "You hurt?" The boy shook his head rapidly. "Truck won't move!" Daniel recognized him then. Caleb Turner, skinny kid with freckles and messy blonde hair who helped his father at the gas station after school. Daniel carefully opened the driver's side door while snow blasted into the cab. "Where's your dad?" "Back in town," Caleb stammered. "I took the truck because our dog ran off during the storm." Shadow suddenly jumped onto the seat beside the terrified boy and pressed against him calmly. Caleb grabbed the German shepherd immediately, like a drowning person finding solid ground. Daniel radioed emergency services while securing ropes around the unstable truck. The rescue took nearly 40 freezing minutes. By the time Sheriff Collins finally arrived with plows, Daniel's gloves had frozen stiff, and Shadow's fur glittered white with ice. Caleb refused to let go of the dog until his father reached them. Ben Turner arrived moments later looking half-mad with panic. Tall, broad-chested, with rough, mechanic hands, and exhaustion carved permanently around his eyes after years raising Caleb alone, following his wife's death from cancer.
The man nearly collapsed, hugging his son. "Thank God," he whispered repeatedly. Caleb pointed toward Shadow while shivering beneath blankets. "The dog found me first." Ben looked toward Daniel and the shepherd standing beside him in the storm. Gratitude hit the man so hard he could barely speak. Daniel only nodded once. "Get him warm." Hours later, long after the blizzard quieted slightly, Daniel finally returned home with Shadow beside him. Snow covered the porch completely now. But the moment Daniel stepped inside the cabin, something felt wrong. The silence, the smell, the position of the kitchen chair near the counter. Shadow growled instantly. Low, dangerous. Daniel's entire body tightened. The cabin had been searched. Drawers hung open. Papers littered the floor. Cabinet doors stood crooked. Someone had gone through the place carefully while Daniel was gone. Daniel moved quickly toward the kitchen counter, where his notebooks usually rested. Empty. The water sample records were gone. The storm left Cedar Hollow buried beneath a heavy silence the following morning. Snow rested thick across rooftops and pine branches, while Elk River moved unseen beneath layers of ice and frost, carrying its poisoned current quietly through the valley, like a wound hidden beneath skin. Daniel Brooks stood alone inside his cabin, staring at the chaos left behind by whoever had searched the place during the night. Drawers remained overturned. Papers littered the floorboards. One kitchen chair lay broken beside the wall where someone had shoved it aside too hard. Shadow moved slowly through the room, nose low, studying unfamiliar scents with deep concentration. The German shepherd's thick fur still carried traces of frozen snow from the rescue the night before, but exhaustion had not dulled his instincts. He stopped beside the empty spot on the counter where Daniel kept the water sample notes and growled softly. Daniel crouched beside him. "Yeah," he murmured. They knew exactly what they wanted. Something colder than anger settled inside him then. Precision. Whoever entered the cabin did not steal money, weapons, or electronics. They came specifically for the notebooks tracking contamination along Elk River. That meant somebody was watching him. Shadow suddenly lifted his scarred ear toward the porch. Tires. Daniel heard them seconds later. Emily Carter's truck rolled slowly into the driveway through deep snow. She stepped out wearing a dark green parka with snowflakes tangled through her auburn hair. The moment she entered the cabin, her expression tightened. "Oh my God." Daniel remained calm, though calmness in men like him often looked frighteningly close to violence. They took the records. Emily walked carefully through the mess. "Did you call Sheriff Collins?" Daniel gave a humorless smile. "Not yet." Emily stopped beside the broken chair. "Daniel, I know." But he did know. Sheriff Collins would ask questions, promise concern. Then probably remind everyone that Blackstone Energy employed nearly 60 local workers already and planned to reopen the mine fully by spring. Cedar Hollow needed jobs desperately enough to forgive dangerous things. That truth poisoned the town almost as much as the river itself. Shadow approached Emily slowly and pressed his nose gently against her gloved hand. Emily smiled faintly before scratching behind his scarred ear. "At least you still have your bodyguard." Shadow's tail moved once against the floor. Daniel watched them quietly. Something warm stirred painfully in his chest whenever Emily smiled at the dog like that. Dangerous warmth. The kind, lonely men learned to avoid because it made losing things unbearable later. By noon, the three of them sat inside Walter Hayes's workshop while wind rattled softly against the windows.
Walter looked older today somehow, more tired. Maps covered nearly every surface, while chemical reports sat scattered across the table beside mugs of cold coffee. Maggie, the old border collie, slept beneath Walter's chair, occasionally twitching in dreams. Walter adjusted his glasses and slid several laboratory printouts toward Daniel. I had a friend at the state environmental office run the samples quietly. Daniel studied the pages. Heavy metal contamination, industrial solvents, toxic runoff indicators. Walter rubbed one hand slowly through his gray beard. It's Blackstone. Emily folded her arms tightly. You're certain? Walter nodded grimly. The concentrations are too high for natural leakage. Somebody's actively dumping into the drainage system. Silence settled heavily through the workshop. Daniel stared toward the snow-covered window. Then we take it to Collins. Walter hesitated. That hesitation alone told Daniel enough. What? Walter sighed deeply. Collins knows more than he admits. Emily frowned sharply. You think he's involved? No. Walter looked genuinely uncomfortable. But Blackstone promised to restore Cedar Hollow. Jobs, infrastructure, tourism money. After the mine closed, this town nearly died. He gestured toward the window. People are scared of losing hope again. Daniel's jaw tightened. So they ignore poisoned water? Walter looked down at the reports. People ignore many things when survival gets involved. That sentence stayed with Daniel long after they left the workshop, because he understood it too well. Overseas, he had watched good men stay silent about terrible orders simply because they wanted to go home alive. Fear changed morality into negotiation. Later that afternoon, Daniel finally visited the sheriff's office anyway. Sheriff Owen Collins stood near the front desk holding a coffee mug in one broad hand. He was a large man in his late 50s with thinning brown hair, tired eyes, and the heavy build of someone worn down by responsibility more than age. Collins had once been sharp and ambitious before decades of small-town problems slowly exhausted him into caution. Daniel respected him once, maybe still did a little. Collins looked up as Daniel entered. Heard about your cabin. Word travels fast. Collins sighed. Small town. Daniel placed the contamination reports carefully on the desk. Walter confirmed toxic dumping. Collins skimmed the papers silently. His expression barely changed. That bothered Daniel more than outright denial would have. These aren't official reports, Collins said finally. Daniel stared at him. The river's poisoned. Maybe. Collins rubbed his forehead tiredly. Daniel, Blackstone's already employing people again. Families finally have steady paychecks. Daniel leaned closer. Animals are dying. Collins looked away first. That tiny movement said everything. You think I don't care? The sheriff muttered quietly. My own nephew works maintenance up there. Half this town depends on that mine reopening. Daniel's voice hardened. And what happens when the water gets worse? Collins exhaled slowly through his nose. I'm asking you not to turn this place into a war zone before we know exactly what we're dealing with. Daniel left without another word. Outside, snow drifted softly across Main Street, while Cedar Hollow carried on pretending everything remained normal. But normal things did not poison rivers. Over the following days, shadow slowly became something unexpected inside the town. A symbol. Children waved whenever Daniel walked him through Main Street. Elderly residents sitting alone outside the diner often smiled when the German shepherd approached quietly beside their benches. Somehow Shadow always seemed drawn toward lonely people. One afternoon, Daniel found the dog lying calmly beside old Mrs. Harper near the church steps while she cried softly into a tissue. Mrs.
Harper was 81, tiny and bird-like beneath heavy winter coats, with deeply wrinkled skin and watery blue eyes weakened by cataracts. Her husband died 2 winters earlier, and loneliness now followed her everywhere like a second shadow. Shadow rested his head gently against her knees while she stroked his fur with trembling hands. "He reminds me of our shepherd Daisy," she whispered to Daniel. "Dogs know when people are hurting." Daniel looked down at Shadow. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think they do." Emily noticed those moments too, and each time she watched Daniel standing beside the dog beneath falling snow, something inside her softened a little more. She tried hiding it behind humor or casual conversation, but feelings had begun growing quietly between them, despite Daniel's constant distance. One evening, she invited him for dinner after helping her repair a frozen pipe outside her father's house. Robert Carter had gone to sleep early upstairs, while snow tapped softly against the windows downstairs. Emily set bowls of homemade stew onto the kitchen table. Candlelight warmed the small room because another storm threatened the power lines again. Daniel sat stiffly beside the fire, while Shadow slept near the doorway. Emily studied him across the table. "You know," she said softly, "most people would have left town by now." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Most people didn't find Shadow beside that river." Emily looked into her bowl briefly before speaking again. "You keep acting like caring about something is dangerous." Daniel froze almost invisibly. Emily continued carefully. "I see the way you pull away every time someone gets close." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel spoke quietly without meeting her eyes. "Overseas, people died because I got attached." Emily's expression softened painfully. Daniel stared toward the fire.
One of our canine units took an explosion meant for me.
His voice remained calm, but the calm sounded fragile now. "After that, I figured distance was safer." Emily reached across the table slowly, resting her fingers lightly over his hand. "Distance isn't the same thing as healing." For one dangerous second, Daniel almost let himself believe her. Then headlights suddenly swept across the cabin windows outside. Both Daniel and Shadow reacted instantly. Shadow rose with a low growl, while Daniel moved toward the door. Outside, no vehicle remained, only darkness and drifting snow. But resting near the porch steps sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. Daniel picked it up carefully. Inside was a black USB drive and a folded handwritten note. The message contained only 7 words. "They know you're investigating. Stop now." The blizzard arrived before sunset, like something ancient and angry descending from the mountains. Wind slammed against Cedar Hollow, hard enough to rattle windows and bury parked trucks beneath fresh snow within minutes. The pine trees surrounding the valley bent under the force of the storm, while Elk River disappeared completely beneath sheets of blowing white. Porch lights became blurred halos in the darkness, and by early evening, most people in town had already locked their doors and settled beside fireplaces to wait out the night. Daniel Brooks stood inside his cabin, staring through the frosted windows while Shadow paced restlessly near the door. Ever since the mysterious USB appeared on the porch, the dog had become more alert than usual, reacting sharply to distant engines, shifting wind, even unfamiliar footsteps outside the property. The German shepherd's instincts never relaxed completely anymore, as if he understood danger was circling closer around both of them. Daniel turned the small black USB drive over in his hand again. He had spent most of the afternoon debating whether to open it alone or bring it straight to Walter and Emily. Before he could decide, the cabin lights flickered violently once. Then everything went black. Wind roared outside, immediately louder without the comforting hum of electricity inside the walls. Shadow lifted his head sharply. "Easy," Daniel muttered automatically while reaching for the flashlight near the counter. The beam cut across the dark cabin just as Daniel's phone vibrated. Emily. He answered instantly.
"Daniel?"
Her voice came through breathless and tense over the storm static.
"The clinic lost power completely."
Daniel's stomach tightened. "Backup generator?"
"Dead."
He heard barking somewhere behind her, metal rattling, animals crying in fear. Emily lowered her voice.
"I checked outside. Somebody cut the fuel line."
Daniel went still. That was no storm accident. How bad?
6 animals inside.
2 recovering surgeries. 3 river poisoning cases. The heating system's dropping fast. Daniel grabbed his coat immediately. "I'm coming." "Roads are closing." "I said I'm coming." He hung up before she could argue further. Shadow was already standing by the door before Daniel turned around. Snow exploded inward the moment they stepped outside. The storm hit like fists. Daniel loaded a portable generator into the truck bed, while Shadow leapt into the passenger seat without hesitation. Visibility barely reached beyond the hood. Driving through Cedar Hollow felt like steering through moving clouds. The town had merely vanished beneath white darkness. Daniel passed abandoned vehicles already half buried in drifts, while emergency sirens echoed faintly somewhere farther down Main Street. Near Martha Greene's bakery, he spotted movement through the storm. Several figures carried blankets and boxes through the snow toward the church hall. Daniel slowed long enough to see Martha herself marching forward, wrapped in her red wool coat like an angry general leading troops into battle. Beside her trudged Dolores Bennett, carrying an enormous soup pot against her chest, while Evelyn Pike directed 2 teenage boys hauling crates of bottled water. Martha noticed Daniel's truck immediately and pointed toward him dramatically.
"Veterinary clinic!"
she shouted over the wind.
"We're setting up emergency shelter at the church."
Daniel nodded once. "Need help?" Martha snorted loudly.
"I survived 3 husbands and disco music. Go save your doctor."
Even through the storm, Daniel almost smiled. Inside the church hall, nearly 20 townspeople already gathered beneath lantern light, while volunteers moved between tables distributing blankets and hot soup. Nobody called themselves heroes. Nobody made speeches. But slowly, quietly, Cedar Hollow had begun taking care of itself. The drive to Emily's clinic became worse beyond Main Street, where snowdrifts swallowed entire sections of road. Twice, Daniel nearly lost control of the truck. Shadow remained rigid beside him, ears forward, amber eyes focused on the storm outside. Then suddenly the dog barked once, sharply. Daniel slammed the brakes instinctively. Seconds later, a huge pine branch crashed across the road directly ahead where the truck would have been. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Good catch." Shadow kept staring into the white darkness. The clinic finally appeared through swirling snow like a lonely ship stranded at sea. Emergency lanterns glowed weakly through the windows. Daniel carried the generator through knee-deep drifts while Shadow bounded beside him. The moment Emily opened the door, warm, frightened air rushed outward, carrying the smells of wet fur, antiseptic, and fear. "Thank God," she whispered. Her cheeks were flushed red from cold and stress, while loose strands of auburn hair clung damply to her face. Daniel followed her inside quickly, The clinic felt unnaturally cold already. Dogs barked nervously from kennels, while somewhere deeper inside, a cat shrieked in panic. Shadow moved immediately down the hallway, calm but alert, pausing beside several cages as if reassuring the frightened animals simply through presence. One trembling Labrador recovering from surgery stopped whining entirely after Shadow stood beside the kennel for several moments. Emily noticed too. "He does that constantly now," she said quietly. "Like he thinks protecting things is his job." Daniel looked toward the shepherd. Maybe it is. They worked together for nearly an hour while the storm battered the building. Daniel connected the generator outside, while Emily wrapped animals in heated blankets and checked IV lines by flashlight. Shadow moved constantly between rooms beside them, never straying far from either human. During one trip outside, Daniel discovered deep boot prints near the clinic's rear generator shed, almost completely buried by fresh snow. Too deliberate for coincidence. Someone had sabotaged the power intentionally before the storm hit. When he returned inside, Emily read the answer on his face immediately. "Someone did this." Daniel nodded grimly. Fuel line was cut clean. Fear flickered briefly through Emily's eyes before anger replaced it. "They're trying to scare us." Daniel removed his snow-covered gloves slowly. "Maybe." Shadow suddenly growled low near the front entrance. Every hair along his back lifted. Daniel turned instantly toward the sound just as heavy knocking shook the clinic door. Emily froze. Daniel stepped forward carefully and opened it halfway. Sheriff Owen Collins stumbled inside through blowing snow. His heavy coat carried inches of ice, while exhaustion hollowed his face deeper than usual. "Roads are closing fast," Collins said between breaths. "Town transformer blew 30 minutes ago. We've got people stranded everywhere." He noticed the running generator outside. "You brought backup power?" Daniel nodded once. Collins looked around the freezing clinic, filled with frightened animals and exhausted volunteers. Something ashamed passed briefly across his expression. "You two need help?" Before either could answer, another vehicle arrived outside. Martha Greene burst through the doorway moments later, carrying containers of soup, while Dolores and Evelyn followed behind her, dragging armfuls of blankets. Snow swirled wildly around them. "Move aside!" Martha barked immediately. "This place smells like panic and terrible coffee." Emily blinked in disbelief. "Martha?" "What?" "Did you think old women hibernate?" Within minutes, the clinic transformed into organized chaos, fueled entirely by stubborn kindness. Dolores distributed blankets around animal kennels, while Evelyn organized medications by lantern light with schoolteacher precision. Martha force-fed soup into everyone's hands, whether they protested or not. Sheriff Collins even helped stack firewood beside the portable heaters, without anyone mentioning politics or Blackstone energy for once. Outside, the storm screamed louder, but inside the clinic, warmth slowly returned. Later, after midnight, when most animals finally settled into uneasy sleep, Daniel remembered the USB drive still inside his jacket pocket. Emily and Walter gathered near the small office computer, while Shadow lay stretched across the doorway, watching the hallway carefully. Sheriff Collins remained nearby too, silent and exhausted. Daniel inserted the drive slowly. Static flickered across the monitor first. Then video appeared. Grainy nighttime footage. Snow falling hard beneath floodlights. A drainage pipe extending from Blackstone Ridge directly toward Elk River. Thick, dark liquid pouring violently into the water below. Chemicals. Industrial runoff. Poison. time-stamped only 6 nights earlier. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The only sound came from the storm outside and the faint hum of the clinic keeping the clinic alive. Walter removed his glasses slowly. Dear God. Emily covered her mouth. Sheriff Collins stared at the screen like a man watching his own town drown in front of him. Daniel looked down at Shadow, lying quietly beside the doorway. The German shepherd raised his scarred head slightly, amber eyes reflecting the glow of the computer screen. They finally had proof. The storm finally loosened its grip on Cedar Hollow 2 days later, leaving the town buried beneath deep snowdrifts and strange, uneasy quiet. Roofs sagged beneath thick white layers, while Elk River disappeared almost entirely under frozen sheets, stained faintly gray near the edges. The air smelled cleaner after the storm, but Daniel Brooks no longer trusted clean air. Poison could hide beneath beautiful things for a very long time. Morning sunlight spread weakly through the pine trees surrounding his cabin, while Shadow stood motionless near the frozen porch steps, staring north toward Blackstone Ridge again. The German shepherd had become restless since the night they discovered the video on the USB drive. He paced more often, slept lighter. Occasionally, he stopped mid-step, as though hearing distant sounds nobody else could detect. Daniel noticed every change. Men trained for war learned to notice small shifts before disasters arrived. Inside the cabin, the stolen notebooks still haunted him more than he admitted aloud. He had recreated some notes from memory, but not all of them. Whoever searched the cabin wanted to slow the investigation, maybe frighten him into stopping completely. Instead, the theft only sharpened something old inside him. Not anger exactly. Purpose. Emily arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying fresh coffee and a paper bag from Martha's bakery. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and loose strands of auburn hair escaped beneath a dark wool hat. She looked tired again. Everyone in Cedar Hollow looked tired lately. "Walter called," she said while stepping inside. "He wants us at the workshop." Daniel accepted the coffee silently. Shadow immediately approached Emily, pressing his nose briefly against her gloved hand before returning to the doorway. Emily smiled faintly. "He checks on me now like I'm part of the pack." Daniel glanced toward the dog. "You probably are." The words escaped before he could stop them. Emily looked at him carefully, warmth flickering quietly behind her green eyes. Daniel immediately focused on his coffee instead. Walter Hayes waited inside his cluttered workshop, surrounded by maps, folders, and printed screenshots from the USB footage spread across every available surface. The old hydrologist looked even more disheveled than usual, silver beard untamed and sweater stained with coffee near one shoulder. Maggie, the border collie, slept beneath the desk, while an ancient radio murmured weather updates softly in the corner. But Walter was not alone. A woman stood near the far wall studying the video stills pinned beneath lamplight. She turned slowly when Daniel entered. Grace Holloway looked somewhere near 65, tall and narrow-shouldered, with weathered skin shaped by years outdoors. Long silver hair hung braided down her back beneath a faded ranger cap. Her pale gray eyes carried the alert stillness of someone who spent most of life listening to forests instead of people. She wore an old green field jacket, patched repeatedly at the elbows, and heavy winter boots still dusted with snow. Everything about her suggested endurance rather than comfort. Walter cleared his throat softly. "Grace used to work the Northern Ranger districts." Grace's eyes moved toward Shadow standing beside Daniel. The moment she saw the German shepherd clearly, something inside her face broke open. Not shock, recognition. Deep and painful. Shadow froze too.
His scarred ear lifted sharply. The dog stepped forward slowly, studying her with intense amber eyes. Grace whispered only one word. "Scout." Silence filled the workshop immediately. Daniel frowned. "Scout?" Grace crouched carefully despite stiff knees and held out one trembling hand. Shadow approached without fear. Then suddenly the dog pressed his muzzle against her palm and released a low sound deep in his throat that Daniel had never heard before. Not a growl, not pain. Something heartbreakingly close to memory. Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. Emily exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. Walter removed his glasses slowly. "You know him?" Grace nodded once while stroking the scar along Shadow's ear. "My husband's dog." Daniel felt the room tighten around that sentence. Grace stood again carefully, though grief seemed to weigh visibly against her shoulders now. "His name wasn't Shadow," she said quietly. "Walter called him Scout." Daniel looked toward the German Shepherd. The dog remained pressed beside Grace's leg like something long lost had suddenly returned from the dead. Grace stared at him with watery eyes she clearly hated having. "Tom found him abandoned near a wildfire rescue site 4 years ago," she explained softly. "Half-starved puppy, big paws. Too stubborn to quit breathing." A faint smile touched her weathered face briefly. "Tom said the dog looked at him like they already belonged together." Walter leaned quietly against the table. Tom Holloway was one of the best rangers in the valley. Daniel noticed the way Walter used "was." Grace noticed too. He died last winter. Silence again. Even Maggie lifted her head slightly now, as though sadness itself carried a scent dogs recognized. Grace walked slowly toward the map table, while Shadow followed beside her without hesitation. "Tom started investigating Blackstone Ridge almost a year before the mine reopened," she said. "Dead fish, sick deer, missing waterfowl." Daniel felt his pulse slow into dangerous calmness. "He told people?" Grace laughed softly, without humor. "Nobody listened. Cedar Hollow wanted jobs too badly." She opened an old leather satchel resting beside the maps and removed several weathered notebooks tied together with string. Daniel stared immediately, because the notebooks looked painfully familiar. Ranger field journals, mud-stained pages, handwritten coordinates, water observations. Grace laid them gently on the table. "Tom kept copies of everything." Walter carefully opened one notebook beneath the lamp. The pages contained dates, contamination sketches, wildlife reports, photographs clipped beside notes. Emily covered her mouth quietly while reading one page, describing chemical smells near Elk River months before Shadow had been found there. Daniel picked up another journal. Inside, he found a photograph of Tom Holloway standing beside Scout near a snowy ranger trail. Tom looked lean and broad-shouldered beneath his winter gear, with dark beard stubble and deeply lined eyes shaped by years outdoors. One hand rested proudly against the German Shepherd's back. Scout looked younger then, but unmistakably the same dog. "How did Tom die?" Daniel asked quietly. Grace hesitated too long. "Officially," she replied softly. "Heart attack during a snowstorm near Blackstone Ridge." Daniel looked up immediately. Grace met his eyes steadily now. "But Tom was healthier than me. Hiked mountains every week, never missed a physical in 20 years. Walter closed one notebook carefully. "You think somebody killed him?" Grace stared toward the falling snow outside the workshop windows. I think my husband discovered something people wanted buried.
Shadow suddenly moved toward the workshop door. His posture changed instantly, alert, rigid, focused. Daniel recognized it at once. The dog had picked up a scent.
Scout,
Grace whispered automatically before correcting herself softly.
Shadow.
But the German shepherd barely reacted to either name now. He whined low in his throat while pacing toward the exit repeatedly. Daniel grabbed his coat. "What is it?" Shadow barked once sharply and shoved against the door with his shoulder. Walter frowned.
That dog's trying to show us something.
20 minutes later, Daniel and Shadow moved through deep snow near the lower slopes beneath Blackstone Ridge, while fading daylight turned the mountains blue-gray. Grace insisted on joining them despite Walter's protests. The old ranger moved surprisingly well through rough terrain, following Shadow's tracks with practiced confidence. Shadow led them farther north than Daniel expected, weaving through frozen pines toward an abandoned maintenance trail almost entirely hidden beneath snow. The chemical smell hit Daniel first moments later. Strong, bitter, industrial. Shadow stopped beside a rocky hillside where snow covered part of an old metal structure, half buried in ice and brush. Daniel brushed snow aside carefully with gloved hands. Rusted steel emerged beneath the white. A sealed tunnel entrance. Grace stared at it silently.
Tom mentioned old maintenance tunnels once, she whispered.
Shadow growled low and moved closer to the metal opening. Wind shifted across the mountainside. Suddenly, the chemical stench poured outward stronger than before through cracks beneath the rusted hatch. Daniel looked toward the darkness beyond the tunnel grate, while cold certainty settled into his chest. The poison was coming from underground. The mountains surrounding Cedar Hollow looked almost peaceful beneath the pale February sky, but peace had become a dangerous illusion in town. Snow still covered the roads and rooftops, yet underneath that white silence, the community had begun splitting apart like ice cracking over deep water. People no longer spoke casually inside diners or grocery lines whenever Blackstone Ridge came up. Voices lowered. Eyes shifted away. Old friendships stiffened under the pressure of fear and money. Daniel Brooks felt it everywhere now. Men who once nodded politely toward him outside the hardware store suddenly looked past him. A few others watched him too carefully, especially after rumors spread about the USB footage and Tom Holloway's old journals. Cedar Hollow had entered the kind of conflict where nobody fired bullets, but everyone carried suspicion like a weapon. Inside Walter Hayes's workshop, the atmosphere felt equally tense. Maps covered the walls from floor to ceiling, while folders of contamination reports crowded every table. Empty coffee mugs sat beside stacks of photographs showing poisoned runoff, dead fish, damaged drainage pipes, and screenshots from the tunnel Shadow had discovered beneath Blackstone Ridge. Walter himself looked more exhausted each day. The old hydrologist's silver beard had grown untidy, and darker circles rested beneath his sharp eyes after nearly a week without proper sleep. He stood beside the table, organizing legal paperwork with obsessive precision. "Chain of custody matters," Walter muttered while sorting labeled sample bags into separate containers. "If the Federal Environmental Office sees even one procedural mistake, Blackstone's lawyers will shred everything." Emily Carter sat nearby, typing witness statements into her laptop, while Shadow slept beside her chair. The German shepherd remained calmer indoors lately, though every unfamiliar sound still caused one scarred ear to rise immediately. Since reuniting with Grace Holloway, something inside the dog seemed steadier, as though part of his old identity had finally returned home. Emily glanced up from the laptop.
How many reports do we have now? Walter adjusted his glasses. 32 documented contamination samples, 12 wildlife fatalities, 6 eyewitness statements. Daniel leaned against the window, watching snow drift beyond the glass. And still not enough. Walter sighed heavily. Against corporations, nothing ever feels like enough. A knock sounded at the workshop door before anyone could continue. Grace Holloway entered, carrying another stack of ranger notebooks beneath one arm. The former ranger looked colder than usual today, silver braid dusted with snow and weathered cheeks red from mountain wind. But determination burned steadily behind her pale gray eyes. Since Scout, Shadow, returned into her life, grief no longer hollowed her completely. Now it sharpened her instead. Found more of Tom's records, she said quietly. Maintenance routes, underground access logs. Daniel immediately stepped closer. Grace handed him one faded notebook. Inside were names, dates, truck deliveries, chemical inventory references. Some entries were circled heavily in red ink. Tom knew they were moving illegal waste, Daniel murmured. Grace nodded once. And somebody knew he was getting close. Silence settled heavily across the workshop. Nobody needed to say the rest aloud anymore. Tom Holloway likely died because he refused to stay quiet. Outside, tension spread through Cedar Hollow almost as quickly as the rumors. Blackstone Energy responded aggressively once whispers of federal investigation began surfacing. Their attorneys arrived from Denver in polished black SUVs, holding private meetings with local officials and business owners. Soon, expensive advertisements appeared around town, promising economic renewal, new jobs, scholarships, healthcare funding, and infrastructure repair if Blackstone Ridge reopened fully by summer. For struggling families, those promises sounded dangerously close to salvation. One evening, Martha Greene organized a community meeting inside the church hall, hoping to stop the town from tearing itself apart completely. Nearly everyone came. Farmers, retired miners, teachers, mechanics, young parents carrying exhausted children. Snow melted slowly from boots across the wooden floors, while tension filled the room thicker than smoke. Martha stood near the front, beneath the old church cross, with her red cardigan wrapped tightly around her shoulders like armor. Beside her sat Evelyn Pike and Dolores Bennett, both looking prepared to verbally assault anyone behaving foolishly. Sheriff Owen Collins stood silently near the back wall. Daniel noticed how tired the sheriff looked now. Not corrupt, just trapped between impossible choices. A man named Curtis Vane spoke first. Curtis worked heavy equipment at Blackstone Ridge and looked exactly like the kind of man mountain towns produced in hard winters. Broad hands scarred from labor, thick beard, powerful shoulders beginning to stoop from exhaustion rather than age. At 45, he carried permanent bitterness behind his eyes after losing his ranch during the economic collapse years earlier. Blackstone had recently hired him back. "People need jobs," Curtis said firmly while facing the room. "My crew finally pays rent again because of that mine." Several others nodded immediately. Then Grace Holloway stood slowly. "And what happens when your children drink poisoned water?" Silence fell again. Curtis looked away first. Another woman rose near the back. Naomi Bell, owner of Cedar Hollow Grocery, was tall and painfully thin, with dark braided hair streaked prematurely gray after years raising 3 children alone following her husband's fatal logging accident. She rarely spoke loudly, but grief had made her honest. "My nephew got sick last month after fishing near Elk River," she said quietly. "Doctors blamed infection. Maybe they were wrong.
Murmurs spread through the hall. Daniel remained silent, watching people fracture into fear and doubt around him. It reminded him too much of military briefings overseas before villages turned against each other. Nobody wanted evil. Most people simply wanted survival badly enough to compromise truth. Martha finally stepped forward.
This isn't about politics anymore,
She snapped sharply.
it's about whether we're willing to trade our river for paychecks.
Curtis stood again, anger rising now.
Easy for retired people to say. Some of us still need work.
Before Martha could answer, Sheriff Collins suddenly doubled over near the wall as his phone rang violently in his hand. The room quieted immediately. Collins listened silently for several seconds while color drained from his face. "Where?" he whispered hoarsely. Daniel felt cold certainty move through him instantly. Collins grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Daniel intercepted him outside beneath falling snow. What happened? Collins looked shattered suddenly. Older. Human. "My son." His voice broke slightly. "Tyler collapsed an hour ago." Daniel frowned. "What?" Collins stared blankly toward the snowy parking lot. "Kid's been sick for days, vomiting, dizzy. They just transferred him to the county hospital." His jaw tightened painfully. Doctors found heavy metal exposure. Snow drifted quietly between them. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing useful left to say. Collins finally looked directly at him, and for the first time since all this began, the sheriff no longer looked uncertain. He looked furious. "Tyler drinks from Elk River during patrol hikes," Collins whispered. "Always has." Daniel saw the moment guilt transformed into resolve inside the older man. Collins pulled a small flash drive from his coat pocket and shoved it toward Daniel. "Security footage from Blackstone's north entrance," he said. "Unregistered chemical shipments, midnight deliveries." Daniel stared at him carefully. Collins met his eyes steadily now. "I should have listened sooner." Snow continued falling softly across Cedar Hollow, while church lights glowed behind them through frosted windows. Inside, townspeople still argued about jobs, survival, and fear. But outside, beneath the winter sky, Sheriff Owen Collins finally chose a side. And somewhere beneath the frozen earth below Blackstone Ridge, poisoned water kept moving silently toward the river. Rain arrived instead of snow, for the first time in weeks, and somehow that felt far more dangerous. Warm storm winds rolled down from the mountains during the night, turning Cedar Hollow's frozen streets into dark rivers of slush and ice. Snowbanks collapsed along the roadsides, while Elk River swelled beneath cracking sheets of ice, its poisoned current rushing louder now, like something finally breaking free after months trapped underground. Daniel Brooks barely slept. He sat near the cabin fireplace long after midnight, watching weather alerts flicker across the television, while Shadow paced restlessly near the windows. The German Shepherd had been unsettled since sunset. Every distant thunderclap made his scarred ear twitch sharply. Several times he walked to the front door and stood there staring into the darkness, as if hearing a call carried through the storm itself. Daniel understood the feeling. Something bad was coming. Around 4 a.m, the emergency phone call finally arrived. Sheriff Owen Collins's voice crackled violently through static.
Blackstone Ridge retention basin just ruptured.
Daniel stood instantly. "How bad?" Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Collins sounded breathless. "Floodwater overwhelmed part of the upper storage system. Chemical runoffs heading straight toward Elk River."
Daniel's stomach dropped cold. Jesus. County emergency crews are already evacuating riverside homes. Collins lowered his voice grimly. But if the secondary drainage tunnels collapse too... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Daniel grabbed his jacket while Shadow immediately sprang toward the door. The dog already knew. Rain hammered against the truck windshield hard enough to blur visibility entirely as Daniel drove through Cedar Hollow. The town had transformed overnight into chaos.
Emergency lights flashed red across flooded intersections, while deputies moved door to door, evacuating families near the lower riverbanks. Water rushed down gutters, carrying branches, mud, and broken ice chunks toward Elk River below. Outside the church hall, Martha Greene stood beneath a yellow rain poncho, shouting instructions at volunteers while holding her phone high above her head. Even soaked by rain, she somehow still looked furious enough to bully the storm itself into retreat. Beside her, Evelyn Pike filmed everything with terrifying calm, while Dolores Bennett loaded blankets and bottled water into pickup trucks. "Keep streaming," Martha barked over the thunder. "If Blackstone lies later, I want the whole damn country watching." Evelyn adjusted her phone carefully. "We already have 20,000 viewers." Martha blinked. "What?" Dolores grinned proudly. "Apparently old women with bad attitudes are internet celebrities now." Daniel almost smiled, despite the tension. Emily Carter appeared moments later beside an ambulance near the church entrance. Rain soaked her auburn hair completely, while exhaustion hollowed her face after nearly 30 hours awake. Yet she still moved steadily between frightened families, helping elderly residents into evacuation vehicles. "River's rising too fast," she told Daniel urgently. "If the contaminated runoff reaches town..." Shadow suddenly barked sharply before she finished. Daniel turned immediately. The German shepherd stood rigid beside the truck, staring north toward Blackstone Ridge through pounding rain. Then, without warning, Shadow bolted. "Shadow!" Daniel ran after him instantly. The dog disappeared into the storm, moving faster than Daniel had seen since before the poisoning. Fear twisted sharply inside Daniel's chest. Shadow was heading back toward the mountain tunnels. "Daniel!" Emily shouted behind him. But Daniel kept running. Rain and melting snow turned the mountain trails into rivers of mud beneath his boots. Branches whipped violently through the wind, while thunder echoed across the valley. Ahead, Shadow moved like a dark shape through the storm, never hesitating once despite the dangerous terrain. Daniel followed by instinct alone. Military training, adrenaline, desperation. They reached the old maintenance tunnels near Blackstone Ridge just before dawn fully broke. Water exploded down the mountainside around them. The rusted hatch Shadow discovered days earlier now stood partially open beneath the force of floodwater, and the smell pouring from inside nearly made Daniel gag. Chemicals, burning metal, death. Shadow barked wildly at the opening. Daniel crouched beside the tunnel entrance and aimed his flashlight downward. Dirty water rushed violently through the underground passage, carrying oily black foam toward Elk River below. Then he saw it. A secondary discharge valve, deeper inside the tunnel, had ruptured completely. Thick, chemical waste poured directly into the flood current. "Oh, God!" Daniel understood instantly. If that valve remained open much longer, the entire toxic reservoir could empty straight into Cedar Hollow's water system within hours. Shadow growled low beside him, soaked fur plastered tightly against his lean frame. Daniel looked toward the raging tunnel current.
There was no time to wait for emergency crews. "Stay close," he muttered. They entered together. The tunnel shook constantly beneath the force of rushing water. Rusted pipes lined the walls overhead, while foul-smelling runoff surged around Daniel's knees deeper inside. Every breath tasted chemical and bitter. Shadow moved ahead carefully through the darkness, occasionally looking back to make sure Daniel followed. Flashlight beams revealed old warning signs half dissolved by corrosion. Hazardous waste storage, emergency overflow systems.
Abandoned decades earlier officially, but not truly abandoned. Blackstone had been using the tunnels secretly for years. Daniel finally spotted the damaged valve chamber ahead. Water exploded from a fractured pipe connection, pouring toxic sludge into the flood runoff. One emergency shutoff wheel remained visible above the rising waterline, but part of the overhead support structure had already collapsed dangerously across the chamber. One wrong movement could bring the whole tunnel down. Shadow barked sharply beside him, as if sensing the danger too. Daniel stepped carefully through the rushing current toward the valve. Every muscle in his body screamed warning. The support beams overhead groaned constantly beneath pressure from the storm above. He reached the wheel and pulled hard. Nothing. Rust locked the mechanism solid. Daniel gritted his teeth and pulled harder with both hands. Metal screamed painfully. Somewhere behind them, part of the tunnel ceiling cracked loudly. Shadow barked again, urgent now. "Almost," Daniel growled. The valve finally shifted slightly. Toxic runoff pressure changed immediately. Daniel pulled again with every ounce of strength left in his body. Suddenly the wheel broke loose completely. The discharge pipe roared violently once before slamming shut. Silence hit the chamber almost instantly, except for rushing floodwater around their legs. Daniel barely had time to exhale before the tunnel ceiling collapsed. The sound came like thunder directly overhead. Shadow lunged forward instinctively, just as steel beams and concrete exploded downward. Daniel shoved the dog aside seconds before part of the collapsing support structure struck him across the shoulder and back. Agony burst through him instantly. He hit the flooded tunnel floor hard enough to lose the flashlight. Darkness swallowed everything. Shadow barked frantically nearby. Daniel tried moving, but pain ripped through his ribs sharply enough to steal breath from his lungs. Dust and chemical-smelling steam filled the air, while broken pipes hissed around them. Somewhere far above, sirens echoed faintly through the storm. Shadow returned immediately beside him, nudging desperately against Daniel's face and shoulder. The German shepherd whined low in panic now, pacing circles through the shallow floodwater before returning again and again beside him. Daniel forced one eye open. "Hey," he whispered painfully. Shadow pressed against him harder. Warm. Alive. Daniel reached weakly toward the dog's soaked fur. Outside the tunnel, Elk River still roared through Cedar Hollow beneath the storm. But the poison pouring toward town had finally stopped. Spring arrived slowly in Cedar Hollow, the way healing often arrived in wounded places. Quietly enough that people almost missed the moment it began. Snow still lingered in the shadows beneath the pine trees, but patches of green finally pushed through the frozen earth beside Elk River. The river itself no longer carried the bitter metallic smell that once haunted the valley all winter. Sunlight touched the moving water again, turning it gold beneath the mornings instead of gray. Ducks returned first, then trout, then the sound of birdsong at dawn, fragile and uncertain at first, before growing louder each week, as though the mountains themselves were slowly remembering how to breathe again. Nearly 4 months had passed since the tunnel collapse beneath Blackstone Ridge. Federal investigators descended on Cedar Hollow shortly afterward with trucks, environmental crews, and enough legal documents to bury Blackstone Energy deeper than the snowstorms ever had.
By April, the company officially shut down operations across the valley. Executives vanished behind lawyers and court hearings, while news channels moved on to fresher disasters somewhere else. But Cedar Hollow remembered. People always remembered the disasters that touched their own rivers. Daniel Brooks stood near the old porch railing outside his cabin one cool morning, watching sunlight spread across Pine Lake. His left shoulder still ached when storms approached, and several thin scars crossed his ribs beneath the flannel shirt Emily insisted he wear instead of old military jackets. Recovery had been slow after the tunnel collapse. 2 cracked ribs, torn ligaments, weeks barely able to lift firewood properly. Yet for the first time in years, Daniel no longer healed alone. Inside the cabin, laughter drifted softly through the open windows. Emily Carter argued cheerfully with Martha Greene about cinnamon rolls, while Shadow wandered lazily between them, searching for fallen crumbs with shameless determination. The German shepherd had changed too. His coat regained full strength and shine beneath the spring sunlight, thick black fur bright against rich brown markings. Though the scar along his ear remained, it no longer looked like evidence of suffering. Instead, it looked like proof he survived. Children in Cedar Hollow now recognized him instantly everywhere he went. People left water bowls outside stores for him. Old Mrs. Harper claimed Shadow visited her porch every Tuesday afternoon exactly 20 minutes before her favorite television program started. Nobody questioned it anymore. The dog had somehow become part of the town itself. "You're staring again," Emily said softly behind Daniel. He turned slightly. She wore faded jeans, work boots, and one of his old flannel shirts rolled at the sleeves. Her auburn hair moved gently in the morning wind, while sunlight warmed the freckles across her pale skin. Months ago, Daniel would have stepped emotionally backward from moments like this. Now he simply reached for the coffee cup she handed him. Emily leaned beside him against the railing. "Walter's bringing the kids around noon." Daniel sighed dramatically. "So my peaceful morning dies in 3 hours?" Emily smiled. "You secretly enjoy it." Daniel grunted something unconvincing. The truth was, she had become frighteningly good at reading him. Beyond the cabin clearing, construction crews worked near the tree line where a series of renovated buildings stood beside the forest edge. The old ranger supply station there had sat abandoned for years after Tom Holloway's death. Now, fresh paint covered the walls, while fenced outdoor enclosures stretched beneath the pines. A wooden sign near the road read, "Cedar Hollow Wildlife and Rescue Center." The project started almost accidentally. First came injured river birds after the contamination cleanup, then abandoned hunting dogs, then orphaned fox cubs discovered near the northern trails. Eventually, Emily looked at Daniel one evening and simply said, "We're already doing the work anyway." Somehow that became enough. Walter Hayes arrived shortly before noon, driving his ancient green pickup truck so slowly it appeared to negotiate separately with every pothole in town. Children packed the truck bed, laughing loudly, while Maggie, the old border collie, sat proudly between them like exhausted royalty tolerating chaos. Walter climbed out stiffly, silver beard longer than ever, but eyes brighter now than they had been in years. Retirement loneliness had faded from him slowly, after he began teaching local children about Elk River and mountain wildlife every Saturday morning.
"River class!"
one little boy shouted, while jumping from the truck. Walter pointed sternly toward the water. "And today," he announced dramatically, "nobody falls in." Martha snorted from the porch swing. "Your standards keep getting lower." Martha herself had become something of a local legend after her storm live streams spread nationally online. Reporters visited Cedar Hollow twice trying to interview her, She insulted both of them on live television after one called her adorable. Now tourists occasionally stopped by the bakery asking for photographs with the angry soup lady from the internet. Martha pretended to hate this deeply, despite secretly enjoying every second. Dolores Bennett claimed Martha practiced looking annoyed in mirrors beforehand. Sheriff Owen Collins also changed over those long winter months. Guilt had carved him quieter, humbler somehow. Tyler Collins recovered fully after treatment for heavy metal exposure, though the sheriff never again allowed official reports to disappear quietly beneath political pressure.
He visited the rescue center often now, carrying donated supplies and awkward apologies nobody forced him to make. Some nights, Daniel even found him sitting alone beside Elk River, staring at the water, with the exhausted gratitude of a man given a second chance he knew he did not entirely deserve. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked alone beside the river trail while Shadow ran ahead through fresh spring grass. The old wooden bridge stretched over Elk River exactly where this strange journey first began months earlier. Water rushed below, clear enough now to reveal smooth stones beneath the current. Daniel stopped midway across the bridge. Sunlight warmed the wood beneath his boots, while pine-scented wind moved softly through the valley. Shadow suddenly bounded back toward him carrying a stick, almost proudly, in his mouth. Daniel laughed quietly despite himself. The sound still felt unfamiliar sometimes. Grace Holloway appeared farther down the trail moments later, carrying a small basket of wildflowers gathered near the ranger paths. The former ranger looked lighter these days, too. Grief still lived inside her, but no longer alone. Scout's return had given her something precious back. Not Tom himself, but proof that love sometimes survived even after death changed shape. "He still checks the old trails," Grace said softly while watching Shadow. Daniel nodded. "Guess some habits stay permanent." Grace smiled faintly. "Tom would have liked what you built here." Daniel looked toward the rescue center visible through the trees. "Wasn't really my plan." "Most good things never are." They stood together quietly while Shadow sprinted along the riverbank, chasing sunlight across the water. Nearby, children laughed during Walter's nature class, while Martha shouted at somebody about proper soup ingredients from half a mile away. The sounds carried warmly through the valley now instead of disappearing into silence. Daniel rested his forearms against the bridge railing. Months earlier, he crossed this same bridge expecting nothing except another lonely morning. Instead, he found a dying dog beside poisoned water and accidentally walked back toward life itself. Shadow suddenly stopped running and turned toward him from the riverbank below. The German shepherd stood tall beneath the golden afternoon sunlight, ears lifted, tail moving slowly behind him, while clear river water rushed peacefully nearby. Daniel felt something settle quietly inside his chest then. Not relief exactly, something deeper, belonging. For years he believed survival meant learning how to live without attachment, without dependence, without hope dangerous enough to lose. But Cedar Hollow had changed him slowly, stubbornly, like spring melting ice no matter how long winter resisted. Daniel looked around the valley one final time, the river healing beneath sunlight, the town breathing again, the people he loved waiting somewhere behind him, and realized that for the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a man surviving the world alone. Because the place once filled only with silence had finally become home. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way people expect. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through a wounded dog beside a frozen river, through strangers who refuse to stop caring, through tired hearts that still choose kindness after years of pain.
Daniel believed he had survived everything life could break inside a man. Yet it was shadow who led him back toward love, friendship, and a home he thought no longer existed. And maybe that is the lesson hidden inside all our lives, that even after the coldest winters, God can still guide us toward healing through the people and creatures placed gently in our path. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story about hope, loyalty, and the quiet miracles that still exist in this world. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that no soul is ever truly abandoned while love still remains.